Hey, what's up you awesome dudes, welcome back to Anthem. Today I'm going to show you finally one build that I was running with on my Storm. It helped me through my entire leveling process as well as right now in Strongholds and pretty much everything on Grandmaster 1. So I'm going to go over it in just a bit and I'm going to show you everything you need to know about it, including the spells that we're going to use, the components, the weapons, and even the strategies you'd be using in order to take on this content. So let's start things off with the Blast Seal, because here is where our primer is, and it's called Winter's Wrath. This is basically an upgraded Ice Storm. It's the Mesowork version of it, and it's actually super useful. It normally does an instant freeze on any enemy out there as long as it doesn't have a shield upon it, but it also does decent damage, about 2000, and it also has an added effect since it's a Mesowork, and that is defeating an enemy from above refills charges, and it can occur every 10 seconds, and it pretty much means that I can spam this almost infinitely. It never goes down, and there's also this gear bonus 35% charges, which means that instead of the 3 times I would normally be able to use it, it lets me to do it 4 times, and it also has a very low cooldown. There's also some other components I have that reduce the cooldown significantly on all my abilities, so I never run out of abilities to use. Literally, this entire build is spammable. That is the biggest plus of it. Of course, the bonuses here that you can see, the inscriptions themselves are not really that great. The only good one is the 35% charges. I would rather have it spammable rather than have it more damage. The damage dealer of this build is actually the Focus Seal, and in this case it's 10,000 suns, which is basically an upgraded burning orb. The bonus effect on this is Striker's Wrath. After hitting an enemy, gain 5% increased damage for 5 seconds, and it stacks up to 20. So the way this works is rather simple. You can even have an entire group of enemy, and for each enemy that you hit, you receive 1 charge of this up until 20. So this means if you hit like 20 enemies, you will stack it to 20, and you will have a 100% bonus damage to this ability. And of course, you also have an additional 60% combo on targets. Combo damage isn't really that high. I would have preferred like straight up elemental damage, but it's the best one I currently have available, so I don't really have anything on top of it. But as you can see here, the damage isn't really that big. It's like 1800 per hit, but that doesn't take into account the fact that this is a charge up ability. So basically, it's true, I can spam this and can do like 2k up to 4k damage per hit, but if I charge it up, I do up to 10,000, sometimes even 15 or 20,000, depending on how many debuffs I have on the target, as well as how many buffs I have myself towards elemental damage and towards ability damage and all of that. But that is mostly coming from our components. Now, in terms of weapons, here is where things start to become a little bit interesting, because this build is extremely versatile. It's very good at both spell damage as well as weak point or weapon damage, and that is because we are using the Avenging Herald and some other components that will buff damage to it. But the Avenging Herald is an amazing gun all around, especially for the Storm, thanks to its Raptor's Deadeye buff. And what this does is that while hovering, it increases weapon damage by a huge 200%. So that is pretty big, and I'm able to do like 7 to 10,000 damage per weak point. So if I'm aiming for those headshots, for those weak point damages, I'm seeing up to 10,000 damage. But it increases my recharge speed on the E ability, which is basically my burning orb, so that is really useful. It also has some rather good bonuses for this weapon, specifically the magazine size increased by 45%, as well as the reload time. It's not a god roll by any means, but it's still a good weapon. Now, on the secondary weapon slot, you can pretty much choose whatever you want to. This is a very versatile build. For example, one favorite of mine is the Thunderbolt of Ivenia. This is very good because it has a 33% chance to deal large electric damage. At the lower item levels, this I have found to be extremely good, like under 450 item level. If you happen to have this one on a Storm, this is going to be extremely good against shielded enemies because it takes them down so fast. It takes down those shields so fast, and at those item levels, you're going to have a rather hard time in dealing damage to shields, but this should help you with that. Otherwise, you can also go with something else. slots, that's why I'm pretty much going to leave the second slot to your choice. Now let's move over to the important stuff, and that is of course this section, the components, aka the trinkets. Now of course in my case I went with a build that is rather versatile. It's very good against multiple types of enemies, and these will help me with that. First we'll have the Amulet of Winter. So this normally increases ice damage by 5% and ice effect by 5%, but applying ice effect increases weapon damage by 40% for 20 seconds. So as I've said, you can also use your weapon, in this case the heavy pistol, so it definitely benefits from this. Otherwise I would have gone for elemental damage. This brings me to the second spot, which is the Mark of Ruin. Increases fire damage by 5% as well as the effect, but while Q recharges, E damage increase by 20% for 20 seconds. This is amazing specifically for one reason. The Q ability in my case is the Winter's Wrath, which in this case is a primer. So that is basically how I'm even starting my fights. I'm using Q at first to freeze up the enemy, and that will give me this buff of 20%, so I can use my E ability, which is the Burning Orb, to deal additional damage to the enemy. So this is a perfect synergy between these two abilities, but of course it will work for something else as well. The Token of Daring, this is mostly for its primary ability. This is increased elemental damage by 35% and decreases physical damage by 35%. So physical damage typically is the weapon damage as well as the melee damage, and the reason I'm even using this is because I'm mostly using spells anyway, and my weapon damage is already high enough that I can sacrifice 35% of it, and I do want to have that spell damage as much as possible because it also provides AOE, and like 85% of the fights in the game are against large groups of enemies, so it's absolutely amazing at doing just that. It also has a rather good damage buff on top of it. A shield break increases seal damage by 20% for 20 seconds, so this is 20% on top of the already existing like 20% that we had previously. Then we have increases the number of combo chains by 2. I'm not really sure how this one works, but for the most part I'm mostly interested in the second skill, which is hitting an enemy with Q increases E damage by 60% for another 5 seconds. So it's pretty much the exact same thing as Mark of Ruin, except the timer is different, and of course the damage increase is also different. So all of these three together all increase the overall damage of just my E ability, which is absolutely insane. Then I'm using an elemental empowerment, or additionally you can go for another elemental synergy. This is also a very good one, and the way this works is very simple. It increases your gear damage by 50% of base, but it lowers recharge rate by 20%. So if you find yourself already being able to spam your abilities, you can definitely go in and use one of this. And beyond of that, you can even combine these two. Like this one increases gear damage by 50% and reduces recharge by 20%, but this one, the Gunslinger Mark, does the opposite, which is increasing the gear recharge and lowering the damage. So they kind of work together in both bringing in 30% more damage as well as 30% more recharge rate, if my calculations are correct, between these two. So you can definitely put them to work together and have both the damage increase as well as the recharge rate to have your abilities being more spammable. Finally, I also have the Gunslinger's Mark. It's basically elemental empowerment, except the masterwork version, and this one unfortunately had its additional buff currently turned off. It's now to 0. This is not a bug. BioWare simply turned this off to 0 because it was abused, and you can stack this infinitely to make like millions of damage in weapon damage, so that's why this was brought up. Last but not least, I'm also going to be going over the support seal, and there's not much here to even talk about. I'm mainly using the Wind Wall, but that is because I have some like rather good stats on them. I have not found myself ever using these support abilities simply because it's not worth it. For the Wind Wall, the cast time is way too long, especially in situations which even require you to use the Wind Wall. So for example, let's say you're against the enemies, and if you try to even cast this while having a lot of enemies attacking you, you'll be subject to a lot of damage because you're pretty much stuck in an animation for like half a second. So that is why almost always I'm not using it. Also because because it doesn't absorb that much damage. Quickening field, arguably this is better if you want to use it, but it's just 20% and you're kind of restricted in a very small bubble when you would otherwise need to float around, change your positioning, and so on and so forth. So how is the playstyle now that you kinda know the entire build? Well, it's rather simple. You start your fights with Winter's Wrath to freeze as many enemies as possible, then charge up your Burning Orb to detonate as many as possible and do as much AOE in the process. And if you have a target that happens to have a shield which wasn't primed or is simply the type of enemy that is too big to even like freeze or anything, you use your weapon. But before using your weapon, make sure to use a freeze effect on it, which in this case of course is the Winter's Wrath, to receive that plus 40% damage increase for your weapon damage. Additionally, you can also pretty much spam your ultimate with this build because you'll be doing so much AoE damage as well as so many combos. So whenever you're low on health, use it strategically, otherwise use it as a huge damage spike when you're on a burn phase, for example on an end boss or whatever. And yeah, that is pretty much it. Tell me what types of builds are you running with your javelins, not just the Storm, the others as well. I'm really curious. I'm also going to be posting way more builds regarding the game, and I'm going to be posting on all of the available javelins. In the meantime, if you guys enjoyed this video, you know what to do. A thumbs up would be super appreciated. Also make sure to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.